Praise John. This is your final critique for Art 828 Creative Photography. I just want to thank you for taking the class. And looking at this portfolio of work, it really jumps out at me, and just wonderfully composed images. They're strong, they're bold, they're contrasty, they challenge my perspective, they challenge me to look and see things in a different way. And those are all good things. I also like in your artist statement, I thought it was well written and thought out. I like how you pick up on the strain of truth in photography, and you kind of you take a lot of the readings and you kind of generalize them, and that's good because you don't need to get in all the details in a simple artist statement. And I really like the line where you said, with all these images in existence, how many of these become instant flashes in our sight and never retained in memory? Because I do think it is interesting. I think I agree that we do mostly see in our minds, these still images as opposed to little clips of movies. So I don't know. That's a place for psychology to look at, but I think it's an interesting idea. So yeah, we see all these things, and how do we make this unconscious decision to retain some things and not others? That's really an interesting psychological question. Okay, so in looking at your photographs, as I said, strongly composed, interesting, dynamic, challenging, just a great sense of composition. And I find photography has always evolved towards a populist medium. It's Kodak, who did it in the 1890s, where they said, well, you don't need to have this darken yourself, you don't need to know all this or learn all this chemistry, learn the optics, you don't need to do that. We'll just give you the camera, sell you some film, you send us that, take the pictures, you send it, we'll do the rest. We'll develop it and make the pictures, and that, of course, revolutionizes photography. And within that next year, there are more photographs that exist in the previous 40 or 50 years to that. So, it always is evolved to an openness and an accessibility. So where that leaves us today, and has for a long time, is, if you can compose, you can take a quote-unquote great photograph. And I love the textures in this image. I love the lighting. I love the rectangular window here, and then the circular window here, and the balance between those things. I like that this is way over here, more of a quarter to, 3/4 over on the right and 3/4 of this space to the left, and then of course the wonderful long shadow, and then the textures. And that's what I find that the emphasis becomes so often in black and white photography. It is shifted from color to texture. We become uber aware of textures, the textures of this brick, the textures of that line, the textures of this, the textures of the steel, the texture of that steel, the texture of this concrete versus that concrete, the texture of this really dark. And look at the nice subtlety. You're doing a really good job exposure, as well as when you get into Photoshop or GIMP or whatever, using it and going to grayscale and playing with the curves, you're still maintaining texture and detail in the shadow area. This shadow area might get inky and black, 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 but you've maintained the interest here where it kind of slowly evolves out into that black. And that's what you need. You don't need to have information everywhere, but you need to create that illusion of information in that viewer's mind, and that's what you do with that area. And of course, the overall diagonal movement of this image is very dynamic, of course. The angles are dynamic and in triangular forms, because we force all these triangular forms. It's a really wonderful photograph, as many of these are. They're really this is really disorienting. It has no grounding, and I'm like this landscape guy, and so many times I'll tell my students, get your landscape, your horizon line level. We have no horizon line here, but we can still tell that, that with all the angles, that somehow it's off, but it really doesn't matter because everything is off, and I don't know if I'm looking up or if I'm looking down, if I'm looking sideways. I'm completely unmoored in that feeling, and that's what helps this image work. I like the light, I like the shadows, the movements, the textures. There's a really nice look at it. And here you use a push and pull of space. There's a flatness in this image. At the same time, this image is very flat. I can just look at its shape and shape. and dark areas and light areas and lines and textures. I can also see space, so it has this interesting space. I can see this close and that far away, or I can completely collapse the space of this image. And there's so many interesting textures and movement of line and contrast and shadow and different values that it really does maintain my interest and move me along. As this is, light becomes a thing here. That's the beautiful thing about photography is at its base, it's nothing more than a study of light. Without light, we have nothing. The photographic tool doesn't work if we don't have light. And this is such a nice meditation on light. And it's a very dynamic meditation. There's diagonal lines this way, and then some movement this way, and then some more irregularly shaped rectilinear forms there. And then the shadows and the values and the high contrast, really pushes me and moves me. It makes me consider, in a sense, nothing, because I'm not concerned with objective things here. It becomes more like abstract expressionist painting, so many of these things. Even though I can recognize bricks and concrete and bolts and those sorts of things, I don't get concerned of those things. I'm looking at the values, I'm looking at the light, I'm looking at the motion. And that last photograph is it. And maybe that's where this work is more of an abstract expressionistic thing. And maybe that's what a lot of modernist photography was this abstract expressionistic expression. And which makes sense because the modernism in photography, modernism in painting, abstract expressionism, and photomodernism are parallel movements, and both under that bigger umbrella of modernism. So it makes sense that they have this similar sort of psychological feel, and we think about psychology and then science and blah, blah, blah. As a student of photography, this is where I go. And this is just a nice composition. You got your X forms, you got your high contrast, your shadows, your highlight shadows, shadow textures, highlight textures, shadow textures, midtones, dynamic, diagonal movements. Again here, and it can be such a pleasure to look at something where I don't have to worry about what it is and what's going on and what's the politics of it. And what, I just look at these and I'm just entranced with the light and shadow and texture and a beautiful moment that I can lose myself in what seems like such a chaotic time. And that brings me to bigger interesting, like, what is the new aesthetic? What is the new art movement? Is it overtly political and engaged, or is it a divorcing of that? Do I want to just leave all that stuff behind and just live in a moment? And these photographs allow me to live in a moment where I don't have to consider that stuff. Of course, I am as I'm talking here, but I can lose myself in this image and the beauty of light, shadow, and texture. And I'm telling you, at that rate, at this moment, feels kind of refreshing, because my mind does get cluttered with the chaos of our everyday lives, personally and culturally and nationally and politically. This is a really wonderful play. I really like this. I assume I'm kind of looking through something that's really close and out of focus of the camera. It might be projected shadows, but I think it's probably I'm looking out onto something through some hold object, and they're out of focus and soft. It really doesn't matter in the end. It has such a lovely feel of this soft, dark shadow texture, and then this really light texture of bricks and concrete and whatever else is going on in them. So this is a really nice contrast of shape, edge shape, quality of shape in a sense, with soft shapes and hard shapes, soft edges and hard edges. And that's where the focus is this. I just look at these lines and the difference of these edges. So this is probably one of my favorite photographs here. We have these inky black things, but we have these general rules where your black should be black but should still have texture, and your highlights should be highlights really light but still have texture. But of course there are places that we can break those rules, and this is a very successful point at which we can break. You are breaking those rules, and it really is good. And so More light, more shadow, more just get caught up in forms and the beauty of a moment. I mean, sometimes that's so refreshing. It does leave me with bigger questions. I'm less engaged with this image, though it is interesting. I love the presence. I guess the presence and the wide-angle lens. I'm going to guess you had a wide-angle lens on this thing, which I don't have the EXIF information. I don't have the metadata to look at that, but I'm assuming a wide-angle lens, and then we get this distortion, from these bricks from wider to narrower as we quickly move up there, and then this edge there is really nice. I like the ones where there's a bit more activity going on and contrast and angles and whatnot. But I can see actually somebody really liking this image, and in some ways it is nice to have a little break, in a sense, from some of these so dynamic images and so contrasty images. It's kind of nice to give the viewer a different thing. And variety is so important when we think, not just within an image, but also within a group of images to have some sort of variety. And this image, for me, fills that. Another person might love this and the other one find the other one's more of a break. And that's okay, and that's what you really want. We can't love, rarely is some person, if they're being honest, love every single image in a body of work. But what I find is successful is when you get different people loving different works. Then you've got a really strong body of work. If everyone loves the same image and finds the other images less impressive, that's a indicator of a weaker grouping of images. I think you've got a strong grouping of images. But what I'm left thinking about as I look at these, wonderful, love it, love the way you're playing with the contrast here, love that super hot, light, dark, hot, cold image, diagonal movement, the more curvilinear, organic movement instead of this really hard rectilinear edges, corners. I like that they're softer. That, in a sense, adds variety. But I look at this work, and then I'm like, okay, great. This is, I think you did such a spot-on job in equating this with Paul Strand. I can totally see Paul Strand in this. And Paul Strand pushes this, this photomodernism, and he creates a new way to see. And I think in the end, I'm always trying to reconcile modernism, postmodernism, and what the hell we're doing right now. And I think the modernists, in general, the photomodernists, modernist painters, they taught us how to see, how to compose, how to, capture the viewer's attention and move them around in the composition. What does that mean that postmodern teaches? Is it that anti, is it just anti? I don't believe it's just anti, but in some ways it can function as that. In some ways postmodern compositions are less dynamic. But what are they asking of us? And I think what the postmodernists ask us to do is to challenge what we are seeing, to not take it as this pure, holy thing, but to take it as we need to think about this. And we need to understand it, understand its perspective, where it's coming from, to determine if it is of ultimate value. And so I don't know. That's kind of, I keep changing that. What the heck is postmodernism? I think it mostly challenges us as viewers because it often has a more static aesthetic, and it looks at even in some ways more mundane things than this, but I don't think you can get more mundane than steps. But what postmodernism does differently is it doesn't give me the dynamics of it. It just looks at the mundane in a mundane way, and then I just have to look at the mundane and consider my mundane existence and see the value in the mundanity instead of trying to take that mundaneness and transform it into something dynamic. I don't know if that made sense. Sounded good at the moment. Okay, another nice body of work. I love back here where you get this diagonal shadow here, really breaking up that. I get this light on here, and this texture, and the little dots, and the movements, and you create a nice, again, the highlights are really blown out in a sense, but there's still just enough there where I accept them from a technical standpoint. And then we have this nice mid-tone back here, and then this stark, inky black with that diagonal edge to it, boom, it's so poppy and nice push and pull of imagery. And this is, again, another nice, beautiful, I love the variety of verticals, vertical dark, vertical light, and then all these little stripy lines, midtones here, slight diagonal, shadow there, another slight diagonal here, even this slight diagonal in there. There's a lot of tension in this image around the edges, pushing and pulling me, demanding me look, keeping me engaged. Your images do that so well. They engage the viewer and they do not let them go. I have to make a decision to move on as opposed to, I'm bored, I need to look at something else. No, I have to make a decision to disengage with these images and move on. And, I think you're really capturing that well. You're capturing that essence of Paul Strand. You're capturing that essence of photomodernism. That is a lovely image too. Wow. I am just so curious as to what I'm looking at and how and what I'm looking through and how you've abstracted it. And I want to look more and more and more and more. Well done, well composed, well executed, well thought out. My big question for you, that's lovely. I like the glass and that reflection, how you use it. But my big question for you is, what are you doing new? Is there a different way that you're pushing it with Strand, or are you just creating something that is completely reflective back to that time, and you're not taking into consideration our current day and age? There's value to that. Absolutely, there's value to it, and there's interest to it, and you've captured my interest, and I want to look at these photographs, and I just want to keep looking at them. Because they're so dynamic and they're so refreshing in a sense that I can just look. And I don't necessarily have to think or be concerned with what it is. But of course I am this academic in this 21st century removed from images like this. And I have to ask, how is this different? How is it new? What is it about? What are you doing differently? Or are we just hearkening back to this age? I don't think any of those questions diminish the work. Maybe there is something more here new that you're doing with them. But that's something to think about, So I don't have any answers for it. I don't necessarily see it new or connect it to my day and age. But, not everything has to be that, All right, well, John, I hope those thoughts help you out understanding your work and are of some interest to you. Thanks again for taking the class. Let me know if you have any questions.